Morrison sat in his command chair aboard the Defiant and listened to the Zalkran commander try to salvage his pride by pointing out the numerical advantage, and the captain understood that some species needed to learn lessons the hard way before they would accept reality, and the Zalkran appeared to be one of those species. Lieutenant Commander Amy Carter stood at her tactical station and monitored the enemy fleet's movements with the calm professionalism that came from 12 years of service in the Earth Defense Force, and she had seen this scenario play out before, with other aggressive species who thought humans would be easy targets. She reported that the Zalkran shields were holding at 98% after absorbing their massive barrage, and she added that the attack had barely registered on their defensive systems and it had tickled more than hurt, and Morrison nodded at her assessment. The captain leaned back in his chair and considered his options for a moment, before deciding that the Zalkran needed another demonstration of what they faced, and he instructed his weapons officer to target the flagship's starboard weapons array with a surgical strike. Paul Henderson sat at the weapons console and acknowledged the order with a simple response, and his fingers moved across the haptic interface with practiced ease, and he had fired the Defiant's railgun systems hundreds of times in combat simulations and dozens of times in actual combat situations. The ship shuddered slightly as the railgun spun up and accelerated a tungsten round to a significant fraction of light speed, and the projectile erupted from the forward battery and crossed the void between the two vessels in approximately 2 seconds. The round punched through the Zalkran flagship's shields without slowing down, and the defensive barrier that should have stopped any conventional weapon simply parted like water before the kinetic projectile and the tungsten round sheared off the entire weapons platform in a brilliant cascade of sparks and atmosphere. Inside the Zalkran flagship, chaos erupted as crew members scrambled to respond to the damage, and Vexthor stared at his displays in complete disbelief because their shields were rated to stop anything used by any known military force in this sector of the galaxy. The commander shouted orders for evasive maneuvers and commanded his entire fleet to scatter using their delta pattern, and 46 warships began moving away from their previous positions and attempted to make themselves harder targets for the terrifyingly accurate human weapons. But the Defiant did not pursue them, and did not fire again, and the human ship simply remained in its position and waited like a predator that knew its prey could not escape, and Morrison allowed the Zalkran fleet to complete their maneuvers before speaking again. The captain opened a channel and explained to Vexthor that the previous shot had been a warning, and he could have targeted the flagship's reactor core with equal ease, and he suggested that the commander reconsider his aggressive approach. Vexthor felt his pride fighting against his survival instinct, and he reminded Morrison that the humans were still outnumbered 46-1, and surely those numbers still meant something in combat. Morrison responded by asking if the commander wanted to see how quickly that number would continue dropping, and the threat was delivered in the same calm tone that suggested the captain was discussing something boring rather than the potential destruction of an entire fleet. Amy Carter pulled up the Zalkran fleet disposition on her tactical display and analyzed their movement patterns before reporting to Morrison that the enemy ships were moving into an encirclement formation, and she recognized it as a classic hammer and anvil tactic. The captain acknowledged her report and told her to let the Zalkran complete their maneuver, and he instructed the helm not to make any sudden movements that might startle the enemy fleet. Ensign Lisa Murphy sat at the helm controls and kept her hands relaxed on the interface as she maintained the Defiant's steady course, and she had learned early in her career that the best pilots knew when not to move, as well as when to act. The Zalkran warships completed their encirclement and created a perfect sphere of firepower around the Defiant, with ships positioned at every angle to ensure maximum coverage, and Vexthor made a gesture that his entire crew understood. 46 warships opened fire simultaneously, and weapons struck the human ship from every possible vector, and the combined assault represented enough destructive power to vaporize a space station, and the Zalkran commander watched his displays and waited for the human ship to crumble under the overwhelming attack. The Defiant's shields flared with brilliant blue light as they absorbed the incoming energy from every direction, and the defensive barrier held steady against the onslaught, and inside the ship, the crew barely felt any impact from the massive bombardment. Amy Carter monitored her console and reported that their shields were holding at 94%, and she noted that the Zalkren were really trying this time with their coordinated assault, and her tone suggested she was not particularly impressed with their efforts. Morrison considered the situation for a moment and decided that the Zalkren needed to understand that continuing this fight would only lead to their destruction, and he instructed Henderson to disable the targeting systems on all enemy ships using non-lethal methods. The weapons officer smiled slightly at the order and acknowledged it before activating the Defiance electronic warfare suite, and the ship's advanced systems began analyzing the Zalkren fleet's computer networks and identifying vulnerabilities in their targeting protocols. Henderson worked quickly at his console and calibrated an electromagnetic pulse specifically designed to disrupt the enemy systems without causing permanent damage, and the pulse would knock out their weapons targeting, but leave life support and other critical systems intact. The Defiant unleashed the electromagnetic pulse, and it spread through space in an invisible wave of energy that washed over every ship in the Zalkren fleet, and in an instant, every targeting computer in 46 warships went completely dark. Weapons that had been firing in coordinated patterns suddenly spun wildly off their intended targets, and some ships accidentally fired on their own allies as their systems failed, and Vexthor watched in horror as his perfectly coordinated attack dissolved into chaos. The commander roared into his fleet channel and ordered all ships to cease fire immediately, and the Zalkren warships went silent as their crews struggled to understand what had happened, and they began attempting to reboot their critical systems. Morrison's voice came through the communication channel again, and he explained what would happen next, and his tone remained maddeningly calm throughout the explanation, and he told Vexthor that the fleet would limp back to wherever they came from. The captain continued and said the Zalkren would inform their superiors that this sector of space was now off limits, and he added that if he ever saw another Zalkren warship within 10 light years of human territory, he would not be as polite as he had been today. Chris Taylor at the navigation console detected a priority transmission coming from the Zalkren homeworld, and he reported to Morrison that someone was sending orders to the fleet commander, and the message instructed Vexthor to destroy the human ship at any cost. Morrison sighed at the news because he had hoped the demonstration would be enough to end this confrontation peacefully, and he asked Carter for a status report on the Defiant's capabilities. The commander knew that his entire military career hung in the balance along with his honor, and his standing in Zalkren society, and everything he had built over 60 cycles of service could disappear in the next few moments, depending on what choice he made. But something else weighed on his mind beyond personal consequences, and Vexthor found himself considering a possibility he had never truly thought about before, and that was the idea of being on the right side of a conflict, rather than just the winning side. Carter leaned over to Morrison and whispered a suggestion that they could offer asylum to the Zalkren commander if he made the right choice, and Morrison nodded at her idea because it made sense to protect someone who was willing to change. The captain told Vexthor that if he made the right decision here, he would not be alone afterward, and humanity would make sure of that, and they would protect him from the consequences of defying unjust orders. Vexthor asked if Morrison was serious about protecting him after he had attempted to destroy the human ship and attacked without provocation, and the commander seemed genuinely confused by the offer of protection. Morrison explained that Vexthor had been following orders from his superiors, and the captain respected that even if those orders were terrible and unjust. But now the commander knew better, and what he did with that knowledge would define who he truly was. The Zalkren commander stared at the human captain for what felt like an eternity, while his tactical displays showed the Kelthran merchant ships moving slowly and peacefully through the system, and they remained completely unaware of the danger. Vexthor finally made his decision and opened a channel to his entire fleet, and his voice carried across to all 46 remaining Zalkren warships, and he gave orders that would change the course of his life. He commanded all Zalkren vessels to stand down immediately and cease all hostile actions, and he specifically ordered them to allow the Kelthran merchant ships safe passage through the contested zone without interference. The response from his subordinate commanders came quickly, and they expressed confusion about the orders because they conflicted with the direct commands they had received from the homeworld. One officer tried to remind Vexthor about their official orders, but the commander interrupted and acknowledged that he was fully aware of what their orders said, and he was also aware that following those orders would result in their complete annihilation. He added that more importantly, he was now aware that their orders were morally wrong, and the Kelthran merchants posed no threat to anyone, and they never had threatened anyone, and there was no justification for attacking peaceful traders. Vex Thor transmitted new coordinates to his fleet and ordered all ships to set course for a position outside the current star system, where they would regroup and consider their next actions. Morrison smiled at the decision and told Carter to open a communication channel with the Kelthran convoy and inform them that they were safe to proceed through the system without fear. Amy Carter opened the channel and identified herself as speaking from the Earthship Defiant, and she explained to the Kelthran merchants that they had safe passage, and the Zalkron fleet was withdrawing from the area. The response from the Kelthran ships came in heavily accented English, and the speaker said they had heard rumors about humans, and asked if Earth people were the ones who did not conquer other species. Morrison confirmed that the rumors were accurate, and explained that humans were simply there to make sure everyone played fairly and followed basic rules of civilized behavior in their interactions. The Kelthran merchant convoy transmitted their gratitude as they passed through the system, and their captains expressed relief at not having to face the Zalkron fleet, and they thanked the humans for their unexpected protection. The Zalkron fleet began its withdrawal maneuver according to Vex Thor's orders, and 45 warships turned and set course for the coordinates their commander had transmitted, but one ship remained behind. Vex Thor's flagship stayed in position near the Defiant, and the commander opened another private channel to Morrison and explained that he could not return to the Zalkron Empire now. He said that by defying direct orders from the homeworld, he had committed treason according to military law, and his life was forfeit if he returned, and the Empire would execute him for his disobedience. Morrison told him simply not to go back then, and reminded him that the humans had been serious about their offer of asylum, and Vex Thor could come with them and help them understand the Zalkron people better. The captain added that the commander could potentially help prevent more conflicts like this one in the future by serving as a bridge between the two species and sharing his knowledge of how the Empire operated. Vex Thor asked if Morrison would actually trust him aboard the human vessel after he had attacked them and tried to destroy their ship, and the commander seemed uncertain about whether the offer was genuine. Morrison explained that trust was something earned over time and not given freely, but everyone deserved a chance to earn it through their actions, and besides, the humans could use someone who understood how the Zalkron Empire thought. The captain added that humanity was relatively new to galactic politics, and having an experienced advisor who knew the major powers would be valuable, and Vex Thor's knowledge could save lives on both sides. Henderson turned from his weapons console and reported to Morrison that they were receiving a transmission from Earth Command, and the military headquarters wanted a status report on the situation. Morrison instructed him to send a message back, explaining that the situation had been resolved peacefully, and they had acquired one potential diplomatic asset, and the Defiant was ready for its next assignment. Lisa Murphy at the helm brought up the navigation display and asked Morrison where they should go next, and she was ready to plot a course as soon as the captain made a decision. Morrison studied the star map that showed hundreds of systems and thousands of potential destinations, and the galaxy was vast and filled with countless species and numerous opportunities for conflict. The captain considered their options and thought about where they could do the most good, and where humanity could prove what it stood for to the other species watching their actions. He decided they would go to the Kelthran homeworld, because if the Zalkron had been harassing the peaceful merchants, then they probably needed help setting up better defensive systems. Morrison added that he wanted to make sure the Kelthran people knew they had friends now and were not alone against aggressive empires, and humanity would stand with peaceful species who just wanted to trade and live quietly. The Defiant began turning and accelerating away from the contested zone, and the ship moved with smooth grace through the void of space as it set course for Kelthran territory. Vex Thor watched from his own flagship and processed everything that had happened in the last hour, and humanity had shattered his entire worldview and offered him mercy when they could have destroyed him. The commander gave orders to his crew, and his ship fell into formation beside the human vessel, and together they left the contested zone behind and headed toward a future that Vex Thor had never imagined possible. 3 months passed, and during that time word of what happened spread through the galaxy's communication networks and species across multiple sectors, heard about the human ship that had disabled an entire Zolkron battle group without destroying a single vessel, and the story grew with each retelling. Amy Carter checked her console carefully and reported that all systems were functioning at optimal levels, and the reactor was operating at only 40% capacity, and they could maintain this level of combat operations indefinitely without any strain on the ship's resources. Morrison nodded at the information and told Henderson to target the Zolkron communication relays because perhaps if the enemy commander could not hear his orders from home, he might make smarter tactical decisions based on the reality of the situation. Before Henderson could execute the order, Vex Thor's voice cut through the communication channel, and his tone had changed noticeably from the arrogant confidence he had displayed at the start of this confrontation, and now he sounded tired and perhaps even respectful. The Zolkron commander requested to speak with Morrison directly, and he specified that he wanted a private channel between the two commanding officers, and Morrison glanced at Carter, who simply shrugged and indicated that the decision was his to make. The captain agreed to the private conversation, and the communication officer routed the channel to his personal display, and the main view screen shimmered before showing Vex Thor's alien features, and the commander looked different now, without the earlier arrogance. Vex Thor began speaking and explained that he had served the Zolkron Empire for 60 cycles, and he had conquered 17 different species during his long military career, and he had never retreated from any battle in all those years, but he was not a fool. Morrison responded with a slight joke about the encirclement maneuver and suggested that perhaps Vex Thor had fooled him a little bit, and the captain's tone was less harsh now that the commander seemed willing to have an actual conversation. The Zolkron commander continued and explained that his superiors back on the homeworld were demanding that he destroy the human ship, and they did not understand what Vex Thor now understood after engaging in combat with the Defiant. He said that the human vessel was not simply a warship like the ones in the Zolkron fleet, and instead it was something different, and it was a weapon, and there was an important difference between those two concepts. Morrison leaned forward in his command chair and told Vex Thor to continue with his thoughts, and the captain wanted to hear what the commander had learned from their brief but educational encounter. Vex Thor explained his analysis of the situation, and he said that if he ordered his remaining fleet to continue attacking the human ship, Morrison would destroy them all, and every single Zolkron vessel would be eliminated, and there would be no survivors. He added that the captain had shown restraint during the engagement and had used non-lethal methods when lethal options were clearly available, and Vex Thor did not believe this restraint came from weakness, but rather from confidence. The commander compared it to the confidence of a predator that knows it cannot lose and knows that the prey has no chance of escape, and therefore does not need to rush or use excessive force to achieve its objectives. The Defiant's bridge crew waited in silence as Morrison considered the Zolkron commander's words, and they had all seen their captain talk his way through difficult situations before. But this was different because an entire fleet hung in the balance. Morrison finally spoke and acknowledged that Vex Thor was more perceptive than most commanders they had encountered, and then he asked for the commander's real name, and not just his rank or title. The alien's mandibles moved in what might have been surprise at the personal question, and he explained that Vex Thor was his actual name because the Zolkron did not separate personal names from rank designations the way humans did. The captain accepted this explanation and then told Vex Thor that he was going to share some information, and he needed the commander to really listen and understand what he was saying, because it was important for the future. Morrison stood from his chair and walked toward the view screen, and behind him Carter watched with quiet admiration, because she had served under Morrison for 4 years, and had seen him defuse situations that should have ended in massive casualties. The captain began explaining that humans had not wanted to be in this part of space, and they had not asked to meet hostile alien species the moment they ventured beyond their home star system, but circumstances had forced them into this position. He gestured toward the ship around them, and explained that the Defiant had been built as a response to the hostile galaxy they had discovered, and the vessel represented humanity's answer to the aggressive empires that seemed to dominate this region of space. Morrison continued and told Vex Thor that the Defiant was not humanity's most powerful warship, and it was not even ranked in their top 20 vessels in terms of combat capability, and they had sent it to this sector because it was considered expendable. The captain asked if Vexthor understood what that information meant about humanity's overall military strength and the implications for anyone who decided to continue hostile actions against human interests. Vexthor's eyes widened visibly on the view screen, and he asked if Morrison was saying that Earth had more ships with capabilities equal to or greater than the Defiant, and his voice carried a note of genuine fear for the first time. Morrison explained that humanity had many different ships, and some were larger, while others were smaller, and all of them had been designed for specific purposes and different tactical situations, and the variety in their fleet reflected their approach to warfare. The captain added that humans did not have an empire, and they did not have any desire to conquer other species or expand their territory through military force, and what they did have was an absolute willingness to defend themselves. He emphasized that they would also defend anyone else who asked for help against aggressive empires and bullies, and this was the foundation of human foreign policy in the galaxy. Greg Palmer at the science station suddenly spoke up and reported that his sensors were detecting multiple new contacts entering the star system, and he analyzed the configuration data and identified them as belonging to the Kelthran Collective. Palmer continued his report and stated that 15 vessels had just arrived, and they were all merchant ships with minimal defensive capabilities, and they appeared to be a peaceful trading convoy passing through the contested zone. The Kelthrans were a species that everyone in this part of space knew about, because they were peaceful traders who refused to engage in military conflicts, and the Zalkran Empire had been systematically bullying them for several months. Vexthor saw the Kelthran ships appear on his own tactical displays, and he explained to Morrison that his orders from the homeworld included engaging and destroying any Kelthran vessels found in contested space. Morrison looked directly at the Zalkran commander through the view screen and told him that he now had a choice to make, and it was perhaps the most important decision of his career. The captain outlined the options clearly, and Vexthor could follow his orders and attack the defenseless merchant ships, and then discover exactly how terrifying a single human warship could be when it stopped showing restraint. Or the commander could break formation and allow the Kelthran merchants to pass through the system safely, and by doing so he would show the Zalkran Empire that perhaps there was a better way to conduct themselves in the galaxy. Vexthor stared at his displays for a long moment and watched the slow-moving Kelthran ships as they proceeded through the system, completely unaware of the armed standoff happening nearby, and the merchants had no idea how close they were to becoming casualties. The darkness of space stretched endlessly in all directions as Commander Vexthor stood on the bridge of his warship and watched the scanning displays with cold satisfaction in his multifaceted eyes. And the Zalkran Empire had ruled this section of the galaxy for 3,000 years without ever meeting a species that could stand against their Crimson Fleet for more than a few rotations of their home star, and today would be no different from any other day of conquest and expansion. His tactical officer made a clicking sound with his mandibles to get attention, and pointed at the main display screen where a single dot appeared near the contested border zone between Zalkran space and the unknown territories beyond, and the dot represented a vessel of unknown origin, drifting slowly through the void like a piece of debris caught in the stellar winds. Vexthor moved closer to examine the readings, and his officers stepped aside to let their commander see the data more clearly, and the ship appeared damaged, or perhaps just primitive in design, with minimal energy signatures coming from its hull, and no apparent weapon systems active on its exterior, and it looked like easy prey for the 47 warships under his command. The commander gestured for his communications officer to open a channel, and the officer complied immediately, as all good Zalkran warriors did when their superior gave an order, and the channel opened with a burst of static before settling into a clear connection, and Vexthor prepared to deliver the standard annexation terms that every conquered species heard before they surrendered or died. But what came through the speakers was not the frightened babbling of primitives or the desperate pleas for mercy that usually greeted the Zalkran fleet, and instead, a calm human voice spoke with a tone that suggested boredom rather than fear, and the voice belonged to someone who clearly did not understand the danger he faced. The human identified himself as Captain Jake Morrison of the Earth vessel Defiant, and he informed Vexthor that the Zalkran fleet had approximately 30 seconds to turn around and leave the area before things became unpleasant, and the entire bridge crew erupted in clicking laughter at the audacity of this tiny species. Vexthor examined his tactical display again and confirmed what he already knew, and one ship faced his battle group of 47 warships, and each of his vessels carried enough firepower to level a small city, and together they could crack a planet's crust, and this human thought he could threaten such power. The commander clicked his mandibles in amusement and informed Captain Morrison that his vessel appeared damaged and perhaps his sensors were malfunctioning because he faced the might of the Zalkran Third Fleet, and surely no rational being would challenge such overwhelming force with a single ship. Morrison's response came back quickly, and he said he could count just fine, and then asked if Vexthor could do the same, and the question made no sense to the commander, who was about to demand an explanation when something happened that changed everything. The human ship suddenly came alive with energy, and what the Zalkran had mistaken for a damaged or primitive vessel transformed before their sensors and hull plates, retracted smoothly to reveal weapon systems unlike anything in the Zalkran military. Database and power readings spiked dramatically as the ship's true capabilities became visible. Vexthor felt a moment of uncertainty, but quickly pushed it aside because numbers mattered in warfare, and he still had 47 ships against one, and he gave the order for all vessels to open fire and teach these humans a lesson about challenging the Zalkran Empire. The space between the fleets erupted with deadly light as 47 warships unleashed their full arsenal, and plasma bolts streaked through the void in brilliant streams of superheated matter, and particle beams lanced out with coherent energy, capable of slicing through reinforced hull plating, and missile pods released their payloads in coordinated salvos designed to overwhelm any defensive system. The weapons converged on the human vessel from multiple angles, and the combined firepower was enough to destroy a small moon. And Vexthor watched with satisfaction as the display showed the Defiant disappearing behind a wall of explosions and energy discharge. But when the weapons fire cleared and the sensors recalibrated to scan through the dissipating energy clouds, something impossible appeared on the tactical display, and the human ship sat exactly where it had been before, and completely untouched by the massive barrage. A shimmering barrier surrounded the Defiant, and it pulsed with a soft blue light that seemed to mock the Zalkran weapons, and Vexthor stared at his screens in disbelief, because their sensors showed the human shields had absorbed every bit of the attack without even flickering. Morrison's voice came through the speakers again, and he said it was the human's turn now, and his tone remained calm and casual, as if he had just watched a minor inconvenience rather than an attack that should have vaporized his ship. The Defiance. Weapon systems locked onto the Zalkran flagship, and Vexthor saw the targeting indicators light up on his threat display, and he opened his mouth to give orders, but the human ship fired before he could speak. A projectile launched from the Defiant and crossed the distance between the vessels in less time than it took for Vexthor to process what was happening, and the round struck his ship's starboard weapons array with devastating precision. The entire weapons platform tore away from the flagship's hull in a cascade of sparks and venting atmosphere, and alarms shrieked throughout the ship as damage control teams scrambled to seal the breach, and emergency force fields activated to prevent further decompression. Vexthor gripped his command console and stared at the damage reports flooding his screens, and the humans had punched through his shields as if they were not even there, and the single shot had done more damage than most species could manage with a sustained bombardment. His crew looked at him with uncertainty in their eyes, and they waited for orders from their commander, who had never faced an enemy that could stand against the Zalkran fleet, and Vexthor realized that perhaps the humans were not as primitive as he had assumed. Morrison's voice filled the bridge again, and he explained that the shot was a warning and he could have hit the flagship's reactor core just as easily, and he suggested that Vexthor reconsider his approach to the situation. The commander felt his pride warring with his survival instinct, and he had spent 60 cycles serving the Empire and conquering lesser species, and he had never retreated from a battle, but he had also never faced an enemy like this. He informed Morrison that the Zalkran fleet still outnumbered the human ship 46-1, and surely that still counted for something in this confrontation. The Zalkran Empire officially declared the border sectors to be neutral territory, and the Emperor never admitted defeat in any public statement, but he also never sent any more fleets to challenge human presence in the region, and the message was clear to everyone who paid attention. Other species across the galaxy took notice of what had happened, and some reacted with fear, while others responded with hope, and the balance of power in several sectors shifted as aggressive empires reconsidered their expansion plans. The Kelthran Collective opened formal trade negotiations with Earth, and their merchants began carrying human goods to markets across dozens of worlds, and the peaceful traders finally had a powerful ally who would protect them from bullies. The Varanth Alliance sent diplomatic envoys to meet with human representatives, and they were interested in establishing peaceful relations and possibly forming mutual defense agreements with this new species that seemed to value justice over conquest. Even some of the more aggressive empires suddenly became very interested in establishing peaceful diplomatic channels with humanity, and they sent ambassadors and trade delegations rather than warships and threats. Morrison sat on the bridge of the Defiant, which now orbited a new world in a different sector of the galaxy, and he read through the latest reports from Earth Command with quiet satisfaction. The captain noted that their actions 3 months ago had created ripples throughout the galactic community, and more species were reaching out to humanity every week, and most of them wanted friendship rather than conflict. Amy Carter stood at her tactical station and monitored the peaceful orbit around the planet below, and she reported that they were receiving a distress call from a mining colony in the Arcturus sector. She explained that the colony was under attack by pirates who were demanding payment for protection, and the miners had refused to pay, and now the pirates were threatening to destroy their facilities and equipment. Morrison stood from his command chair and straightened his uniform before giving orders, and he told Murphy to set a course for the Arcturus sector at maximum speed, and the crew responded immediately to his commands. Greg Palmer smiled from his science station and commented that their reputation seemed to be spreading through the galaxy faster than they could travel, and the distress call had specifically requested human assistance by name. Morrison acknowledged Palmer's observation and said they needed to make sure they lived up to the reputation they were building, and the galaxy was a large place and someone needed to remind the bullies that there were consequences for their actions. The Defiant's engines powered up and the ship jumped to faster than light speed, and it left the peaceful world behind as it raced toward another crisis and another opportunity to demonstrate what humanity stood for. Vexathor stood at his newly installed station on the bridge, and he had been officially designated as the cultural liaison between humanity and the Zalkran Empire, and he watched the human crew work with quiet admiration. The former commander observed how efficiently they operated, and there was no wasted movement or unnecessary aggression, and they were simply competent professionals doing their jobs and fulfilling their responsibilities. He had spent his entire life serving an empire that was built on conquest and military domination, and he had believed that strength meant the ability to crush those who were weaker and force them to submit. But now Vexthor was part of something completely different, and he was learning that real strength meant having the power to destroy, but choosing to protect instead, and that concept would have seemed like weakness 3 months ago. The human ship that had terrified his entire fleet was also the ship that had shown him mercy when it could have easily killed him, and every warrior under his command, and that mercy had been more powerful than any weapon. Morrison had proven that mercy backed by overwhelming force was something that tyrants and aggressive empires could not fight effectively, and it was something they could not understand because their entire worldview was based on domination. Vexthor realized that this combination of strength and compassion was the foundation upon which humanity was building its place among the stars, and it was a foundation that could support something lasting and meaningful. The humans were not entering the galactic community as conquerors who wanted to build an empire, and they were not arriving as victims who would be exploited by stronger species, and neither of those roles fit what they were doing. Instead, they were establishing themselves as protectors who would defend the weak and stand against bullies, and that role was something the galaxy desperately needed, even if many species did not realize it yet. The former commander understood now why that approach was actually the most terrifying thing of all to the predatory empires that had dominated the galaxy for so long. Because mercy backed by overwhelming force could not be defeated through military might, and it could not be corrupted through political maneuvering, and it could not be ignored without facing consequences. The aggressive empires had built their power on fear and intimidation, and they had convinced themselves that compassion was weakness and that showing mercy meant being vulnerable to attack. But humanity was proving that mercy did not mean weakness when it was supported by the capability to destroy anyone who mistook kindness for vulnerability. And that combination was something entirely new. Vexthor had watched Morrison disable an entire fleet without killing anyone, and then offer protection to the commander who had tried to kill him. And that sequence of events had broken every assumption the Zalkron military had about warfare. The Defiant dropped out of faster-than-light travel near the Arcturus mining colony, and the crew immediately began scanning for the pirate ships and preparing to engage if necessary. Morrison opened a communication channel to the pirates and identified himself and explained that they had exactly one chance to leave the area peacefully, and if they refused, then the consequences would be severe. The pirate leader responded with threats and boasts about his ship's capabilities, and he clearly had not heard about what happened 3 months ago in the contested border zone. Carter prepared the weapon systems, and Henderson locked targeting solutions on the pirate vessels, and Murphy positioned the Defiant for optimal engagement angles, and the crew worked with smooth coordination. Morrison gave the pirates 30 seconds to reconsider, and he counted down slowly over the open channel. And when the time expired and the pirates were still threatening the miners, he gave the order to disable their ships. The Defiant's weapons fired with precision, and the pirate vessels lost their engines and weapons in a matter of seconds, and they drifted helplessly in space while their crews frantically tried to restore power. The captain contacted the mining colony and assured them that the pirates would not bother them anymore, and Earth Command would send a patrol ship to collect the criminals and ensure the area remained safe. The miners expressed their gratitude and asked how they could repay humanity for the assistance, and Morrison told them that no payment was necessary, and they should just remember that they had friends in the galaxy now. Vexthor watched the entire encounter and saw how the humans handled the situation with minimum force and maximum effectiveness, and they could have destroyed the pirates, but chose to disable them instead. He understood that this was the pattern. Humanity followed, and they used only the force necessary to achieve their objectives, and they left room for redemption and change, even for those who opposed them. The former commander realized that he had been given that same opportunity 3 months ago, and Morrison had left room for him to choose a better path, and now he was part of something meaningful. The Defiant set course for its next destination, and there were always more places that needed help and more bullies that needed to be reminded about consequences, and more peaceful species that needed to know they were not alone. Morrison returned to his command chair and reviewed the reports from across human space, and the Earth Defense Force was growing and more ships were being built, and humanity's presence in the galaxy was expanding steadily. But the expansion was not driven by conquest or territorial ambition, and instead it was driven by requests for help and invitations to establish peaceful relations, and that was exactly how the captain wanted it to happen. The galaxy was slowly learning that humanity would not be ignored and would not be intimidated, and would not abandon those who needed protection, and that lesson was spreading from world to world and species to species, and the message was clear to everyone who listened, and humanity had arrived among the stars not as conquerors, and not as victims, but as protectors, and that role would define their future in the galaxy for generations to come.